I'm Chrissy Powell. I am co-chair of the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition that was founded in 2020. And at BDEC, our goal is, of course, to bring together leaders from across the nonprofit, public, private, education, philanthropy, and technology sectors. So really to explore the issues shaping digital equity in Baltimore and beyond. So today's conversation is especially timely, and I'm so grateful you all have joined as artificial intelligence rapidly transforms the way we work, the way we learn, and how we serve our communities. So it's critical that we understand both the opportunities and the responsibilities that come with it. And our hope that today's convening will provide practical insights to help us each really prepare our organizations, our workforce, and our communities for the evolving AI economy. Before we introduce today's featured speaker, I am pleased to welcome Baltimore City's Office of Broadband and Digital Equity, their Deputy Director, Whitney Moret. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with their office for the last 5 years. But I want to welcome Whitney, who has a brief announcement to share regarding the city's AI framework. Whitney, I will pass it on over to you.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. I won't take up too much time, but I do want to make you all aware of some exciting activities that the Office of Broadband and Digital Equity will be facilitating over the next few months. Now, many of you know that our 5-year ARPA grant is coming to a close at the end of this calendar year. But our work doesn't end here. We are continuing to look to the future and continue to refine our strategies and approaches. And what that means is that now we're thinking, what does digital equity really look like in the era of AI? So we are turning to the people. We want to work closely with residents and with members of our digital equity ecosystem to help shape a framework for Baltimore City to advance AI equity moving forward. So I have a series of dates here with some upcoming activities. We're going to start by collecting input, and we'd love to start with you all in BDEC as our trusted partners to talk about what a framework really looks like. You'll see a graphic here on the screen. This is sort of a draft framework that we are working with for conceptualizing what the AI equity ecosystem looks like here in Baltimore City. So I'd love to have a conversation with you all to better understand, how we might fit into this, how we might change what this framework looks like, and how we can work together. We're also putting the question out to community members. We're starting with an online input session on August 18th, really inviting community input on, how the city uses and thinks about AI and how we are advancing equitable structures and systems to benefit residents. Now, not yet on the calendar, some in-person input sessions that we are also planning. And we're also aware that, many residents don't have much information on what AI is and how it affects them. Yeah. So we are partnering with the University of Baltimore's Center for AI Learning and Community Engaged Innovation, CALI, to offer workshops to residents to share information on the basics of AI so that people can make informed choices about how they engage with AI, and they'll have a chance to interact with a really cool tool that CALI has developed as well. Now, all that to say is the goal here is to develop a framework, right? So we are, as in previous years, holding 2 convenings leading up to Digital Equity or Digital Inclusion Week. So the first is going to be August 26th at the Factory. This is a half-day event. I think we're looking at 3 to 4 hours here with lunch. And this is really going to be our interactive event, pulling this framework together, getting input from all of our partners across the ecosystem to inform, our strategy moving forward. We want to validate and present and validate this framework during Digital Inclusion Week at another event. This will be October 6th. This is a really important one because this is really our final event for closing out our ARPA grant. So in addition to, helping think about what the future of digital equity looks like in Baltimore, we want to take a moment to acknowledge everything we've accomplished, what we've achieved since last year's convening and commemorate all our wonderful partners, especially those who have served residents through the Digital Equity Fund. Yeah. So those are some quick updates from me. We'll be sending out more information, and I want to thank BDEC for giving us the time to share this and for helping host the meeting, which is in just a couple weeks here, to collect your input. So thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Whitney. We look forward to August 11th, where we will be hosting the Office of Broadband and Digital Equity for this awesome event. So thank you all to your partnership, and thank you for keeping the coalition in mind as we build out Baltimore's AI strategy. So we are excited to move into our featured speaker. I am so pleased to say that our featured speaker today is David Long, founder and CEO of Tuscany Strategy Consulting, and also adjunct faculty member at Johns Hopkins University. Now, David is nationally recognized strategist who helps organizations navigate complex change with expertise in spanning strategy, innovation, workforce transformation, and organizational performance. So he recently worked, his recent work, has focused on the rapidly evolving impact of artificial intelligence on the future of work, leadership, education, and the economy, truly helping organizations understand not just how AI is changing technology, but how it's redefining jobs, how it's redefining decision making and competitive advantage. And through his consulting, teaching, and thought leadership, David equips leaders across the nonprofit, public education, and private sectors with practical strategies to prepare for an AI-driven future. So today he'll share his insights in what we're calling the outcomes-driven AI economy, the end of routine work and the rise of judgment and accountability. Please, the chat is open. So please put your comments in the chat, your questions in the chat if it's pertinent, and we will address it in that moment. Otherwise, we'll save the questions for the end. But please feel free to interact in the chat. I am pleased to introduce David Long. David.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. I appreciate the kind introduction and appreciate the opportunity to present our work to the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition. So greetings from North Baltimore. I'm here with my colleague, Reese Alford, who will be monitoring the chat and answering questions as they come up. I'm going to try to leave some time at the end to go into more discussion as we can. All right. Now, are you seeing the slides? Perfect. So as Chrissy was describing, we have been preoccupied with what is AI going to do to the economy broadly, and what are the implications from a workforce development standpoint, from an education standpoint in particular. So what we're going to show you is the data that we have gathered over the last several years and really processed deeply over the last 6 months or so. And so this is going to be a largely evidence-based approach. And the reason I say that is that most pontification around AI, I think, is people trying to predict the future that cannot be predicted. So a lot of the claims that we hear, which I hope to address, I think are just that, are claims and are not fundamentally grounded in evidence. And I think the reality is no one really knows where all of this stuff is going to take us. So hopefully what we're going to show is going to be a basis for the core principles that are going to really drive how AI is going to unfold across the economy and then more broadly than that. So where I'm going to start is a data set that comes from the St. Louis Federal Reserve that breaks all occupations. This is all non-military occupations in the United States into 4 categories, which are routine and non-routine, and then cognitive and manual. And it's not that any of these categories are entirely, one or the other. There's a mix of all in them, but this is a simplifying principle that allows, it's very powerful as we want to understand how is the economy changing. So this is the same data. So let me go back a little bit. So as an example, knowledge work, which we're going to talk about, is non-routine cognitive work, whereas skilled trades are non-routine manual. This is according to the St. Louis Fed classification. And we put in median wage and the kinds of jobs that are there. This is the same data, but what we're doing is we have laid it out by projected job growth on the bottom axis and annual earnings. So the black line in the middle right here is US median earnings, and the vertical black line is growth. So this is 0%. Anything to the left is declining. Those jobs are shrinking. Anything to the right, the jobs are growing. Okay, so if we start isolating these, we see some very clear patterns emerging. So this is knowledge work. It's generally high paying and growing jobs. Very little of these jobs are actually declining. In contrast, this is services. We still see most of the jobs are growing, although they typically are below US median earnings. So good growth, but not high on the salary side, on the wage side. This is skilled trades, kind of a mixed picture. Some of these are decreasing to some extent. There's still a fair amount of growth. There's also pathways. There are some pathways to higher paying jobs within the skilled trades environment. And then finally, these are administrative jobs. So many of these are lower level sales positions. If you think like the ticket agents who you would call up on the phone and do your travel planning that have largely gone away, that's the prototypical administrative job. It's cognitive, but it's routine work. And this is very susceptible to AI automation. All right. Now, this is the core story that I think drives where AI is going. So what we're seeing is this is the same data, but we're going back to 1981 and we've plotted out all the recessions that have taken place, and you can see how the jobs have grown category by category. So the real story here is this explosion of non-routine work. So if you look at the routine work, which is trades and administration, they are basically flat for the past 40 years. And because there's significant job growth, the total share or the total number of jobs has grown. As a share of employment, trades and administration have actually decreased very sharply over the last 40 years. So the big takeaway that we have is routine work is decreasing. It's now 43% of jobs. It was probably 75% of jobs back in 1980. Whereas non-routine work, which we're calling outcomes-driven work, is now 57% of the economy and increasing. So what characterizes task-driven work is it's very prescribed. I can tell you how to do the job. It's step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can train you on all of those. I can see how you do each task, and I can assess how good a job are you doing by seeing how you execute the individual pieces of it. Outcomes-driven work does not work that way. Here, an individual, or more likely a team, is given an objective and you have to go figure it out. So there's often discovery work that needs to take place. It's harder to train, it's not as prescribed, and something that's very important, the person who is giving the objective probably does not know what the answer looks like. They probably know what good looks like, but they can't necessarily tell you how to get there. So this is requiring a very different kind of skills this is what we think is fundamentally shaping the future economy. And AI really layers into this very nicely. Now, I'm always interested in how this maps over into degrees. So I'm going to show you quickly this is the same data, but we're now showing this in terms of degree attainment. So this is bachelor's degrees or higher, master's, PhDs. It looks very similar to knowledge work. And a big takeaway is there is a lot of noise around colleges losing influence and higher education is dying and things like that. It's nonsense. It is absolute nonsense. The most certain path to a high-paying job is a college education, and the data is very clear on that. I think there is definitely a pendulum swing in terms of what level of education and more interest in skilled trades. So there is some movement in the market, but that's fundamentally, we think more education is better. finishing high school is better than not, getting additional training on top of high school is better than not, and so forth. Okay, associate's degrees, we see a real mix here. This is actually something that I'm always concerned about, is that preschool teachers, a lot of the teaching force that gets associates is not well compensated, which is topic for another day. This is working adults with some college, but who have not actually gotten a degree, which is probably the riskiest position to be in within as a working adult. And by the way, this is not a small number. This is almost 20% of the entire US workforce that has some college and not a degree. One of the things that we're very focused on with higher ed is retention and completion. And then finally, certificates. As we think about workforce development, there is a lot of benefit from getting certificates. It is typically not a high-paying job, which runs counter to much of the narrative around certificates. The way I think about it is, if you get a certificate, you are getting access to a growing job market as opposed to a shrinking job market. Very good outcome, but it is generally not higher incomes. This is high school diploma or equivalent. And actually, it's interesting, there's still a lot of pathways for higher income folks, for people to get to a higher income. If you, even with a high school diploma only, you, with time, moving into a management position moves you up that earnings chart. And then finally, no formal education credential. Right now, the story here, and this is similar data, or this is wealth, US wealth, and the percentage basically owned by people with college degrees and various, high school, no high school. Most of this is really held by folks who have gone to college. And the reason this is important is what is driving this is the ability to do the objectives-based work. That is what has material value in our day and age, in the modern economy. Routine work does not. And what AI is doing, it is automating routine work at a scale that is unprecedented. And so my hypothesis is that at the end of the day, what is really going to drive wealth creation, regardless of who you are in the economy, is the ability to do objectives-based work, where you're told an objective and you figure out how to do it, and you convey confidence, and you do it well, and you explore alternatives, and you provide a good outcome. So when we're talking with universities, K-12, higher education, workforce development, much of our focus is not on what skills do you need, but how do you teach ownership and accountability and things like that. All right, let's talk about what AI is actually doing briefly, because it sets up how do we think about equity in the modern world. All right, so if we type something, whether it's code or a sentence, into a foundation model, into AI, like weights and biases is the machine, it then tokenizes it. It breaks the words of the code, not at the word level, sub-word level, and assigns them a numerical token. And it uses the token. Then what the LLM is doing is creating a set of output probabilities of what the next word is going to be. And by the way, this is why AI can't always spell strawberry, because it's not thinking in terms of words. It doesn't work in terms of words. It's at the sub-word level. So once we have our probabilities, it makes a guess. So this is also the basis why LLMs will hallucinate, because at the end of the day, they're pattern matching. And particularly if you don't manage the context window effectively, it can go way off the rails and just make all kinds of things up. I think in the long run, this is going to be reduced, particularly as people understand how to use it effectively. You can really guard against the hallucination, but this is dialed into the way they work. Now, one of the challenges is that it is like what they're actually doing, how they're optimizing is a black box. It's not clear how they're making their trade-offs. As a firm, we spend a lot of time working with the data and saying what's going on, looking on the back end to see how did it do the analysis, and how do we then change our approach in order to get a good, clean analysis or good work out of it. Okay. And then you can tighten this and make it more accurate by giving it appropriate context, which does a very good job. I think the LLMs of today, AI of July 2026 is fundamentally different from December 2025, and I expect that to continue. Now, the big advancement over the last 6 months in particular has been the advance of agentic AI, where the AI can do tool calls. You can set up a retrieval augmented generation, which means you're giving it significant context and putting a container around it so it can't go off the rails. It can do real-time web searches, which wasn't true really 6 months ago. So we are now looking at a very different world than simply using AI to enter some prompts. It really is becoming an active participant, where I'll give you some examples. So like, I don't read the news that often. Okay, I read some of the news in the morning when I wake up, but I now use AI to source from probably about 90 different news and information sources and give me daily briefings on education, workforce, AI, politics, so I can figure out what do I want to read quicker, and I also can tell it to relate it to the things that I am most interested or actively working on. So it's now becoming very much a part of how we work, not just let's ask it some questions. So a lot of the work that we see, or a lot of the implications of where AI is going, is on the agentic side. And we hear a lot of times like, oh, prompting is dead, which I think is a little bit silly, but it sort of makes the broader point that the way to think about AI is as an active agent that is now and increasingly going to be working with other active agents. So I've left here, we're going to send the slides out to everybody. I've got a list of use cases that we can spend more time talking about, but just some ideas of ways you can integrate AI into your daily work if you're not already doing that. Now, as we think about what is the long-term effect on the labor market, there are countless people saying we're going to have an AI job apocalypse and the world is doomed and this is the worst thing ever. So let's look at the data. This is the same data that we were looking at before: knowledge work, services, trades, and administrative work. And what we're doing is we are plotting on the vertical axis potential exposure to AI. So this is kind of a theoretical measure that comes from, where does this come from? This is government based? Some researcher. Okay. So, and then we've also plotted this against exposure to AI startups. So this is another third-party metric. And by combining them, what we're trying to do is say, who is theoretically exposed and where are people actively trying to displace work? And so it's really, this is the quadrant that is most susceptible to AI substitution and work displacement. Now, if we look at trades and services, it's actually very resilient to artificial intelligence. Now, I think this is going to change over time, but it is a slower moving target, which means there is, from a workforce development standpoint, there is a lot more time to figure this out. And when we talk with workforce development firms, much of the emphasis is not so much on how do people use AI in their work, but how do you change your practices to significantly improve the workforce development and training that's being done. There are a few exceptions to this, like medical transcriptionists. This is a job that my sense is really going to be completely replaced by AI or largely replaced by AI. So that is one area I would not recommend people be going into. But in general, we see a lot of resilience in that part of the economy. Now, to really dig into this group of what's going on, we want to really decompose the jobs. So we're on the left, we're comparing office clerk, which is administrative work, according to the Fred, and a statistician, which is knowledge work, according to their categorization. And we have pulled together skills through the government's ONET system and then categorized them. So the office work is more, they're doing a lot more routine work. And they do certainly some non-routine tasks, but most of it is routine. And where you've got routine work, this is where AI is much more of a substitute. If it's non-routine, AI tends to be a complement and lets you do more than you were doing before. It changes the nature of the work that you're doing. So the statistician also has routine work, but fewer tasks. The core task that they're doing is in this non-routine work. So just to give you an example of carrying the argument forward, this is now a statistician. We've got a whole bunch of skills of what they do, like design research projects using valid scientific techniques. We've asked the question, we've done analysis and said much of that work can be accelerated with an LLM and with AI, but the AI can also expand the work. So it can do rapid prototyping of study designs. It can do scenario planning to help you think through this. It can do literature synthesis extraordinarily effectively if you use it correctly. So what does that leave the human to be doing? Well, it's the causal reasoning, anticipating failure points, ethical considerations. These are things that AI is really not good at and unlikely to be good at anytime soon. So when we think about work across the board, we think there is going to be a decomposition of work, sort of a reshuffling of what people are doing. And it is most acutely affecting people in the knowledge work space, as well as in the cognitive work, if you will. Now, we get asked a lot, okay, well, doesn't this mean that jobs are going to go away? And are we going to have an AI job apocalypse? And we read a lot of this about this. There's a lot of reporting that is doom and gloom, and the world is, going to fall apart. So we're showing the same data again. This is our breakdown of all non-military occupations going back to 1981. And if you look at the group that is, well, both of them, that are really the cognitive work that is really susceptible to technological change or theoretically susceptible, you cannot find any enabling technology. Nothing is disrupting the job growth. So I'm old enough to remember when the internet came out, it was going to be the end of all kinds of jobs. I'm old enough to remember, frankly, when the Texas Instruments Advanced Calculator came out, people were saying the same thing. The World Wide Web has come, laptops, Google was founded, Web 2.0, smartphones, blockchain, Bitcoin, cloud computing, nothing. There is nothing that is fundamentally changing job growth, none of these enabling technologies. And we've plotted out the emergence of ChatGPT 3.5, 4.0, Claude Code, and I think for us to believe that there's going to be an AI job apocalypse, that's an extraordinary claim, and we have to see extraordinary evidence. And we just aren't seeing it in any of the data. Now, let's look at computer and mathematical occupations. So we have recreated a graph that was created by the president of the Burning Glass Institute, where he was saying, I'm now seeing it. I'm seeing AI crushing jobs, getting rid of all of these jobs. Look how bad this is. And he asked, what jobs are decreasing? We asked a different question, which is, how are jobs changing? And what you see there is an incredibly different story. And it really runs counter to this doom and gloom story of AI is going to ruin all these jobs. What we see is it's the same trend we've seen for 40 years. The jobs like web development, network support, computing programming, which technically this is the people who are writing the code predominantly, not planning out how to develop software. They're just writing the code. This is the more routine work. And this decline started years before AI was ever on the scene. What is growing is the jobs with the broader responsibility, like data scientists and software developers, which is the flip side. We're seeing fewer computer programmers and more software developers, essentially. So we've plotted this out for a variety of different um, uh, workforce areas like healthcare and so forth. And we're seeing plenty of disruption, but it's because of this fundamental shift away from routine to non-routine work. Essentially, no one wants to pay for the routine. And we all, through the countless little decisions that we make, end up favoring things where there is more value-added work as a part of the equation. So I get asked all the time about how hard it is for recent college graduates and why the job market is so crazy. And I did want to leave you with some other data here that I think is very useful. What I've done here is I've plotted seven different indicators of uncertainty. And what you're seeing from 2010 to 2018 with all these flat lines, this is normal. This is what normal looks like. This big spike at the left was the Great Recession. The big spike on the right is COVID. And then COVID really caused a complete mess afterwards as supply chains worked themselves. It really reset the world economy. What we see in 2025 is a very different story, which is massive uncertainty I think, by political design. So I think this is really associated with the current approach of the Trump administration and is very different from pressures from AI. And it's a much more compelling story to me than AI is getting rid of all these jobs. Now, as you all think about how AI is going to unfold in your own organizations, we wanted to provide a map based on other enabling technologies. So we think the process is very clear. It starts with tool substitution. So I'm going to write a resume, and when I'm old enough that I would write my first resume on a typewriter. Well, thank goodness we got computers. Now I'm writing it in a word processor, but nothing in the resume is changing. I'm just changing the tool. So over time, that then changes. This is, by the way, I think this is exactly where we are right now. AI is mostly about tool substitution. This is the low-hanging fruit. It's really fun to work with, but the real power is going to unfold over a much longer period of time. The next step is really process reconfiguration. And we are seeing this in our corporate clients. I would say everybody, almost everybody, is trying to figure out how to rework our world using artificial intelligence. But this takes a long time to do because it's high stakes. You can't just throw someone at it with some prompts. You really have to think through all of the systems and how they integrate together. By the way, I've got one other story around why I think software engineers, as an example, are not going away. I've talked to 6 CEOs of software companies in the last 6 to 8 months, and they've all told me the same thing. I got rid of half the staff, and we're 3 to 5 times more productive. We're coding in AI natively. Software engineering is a dying art, and we're never going to hire an entry-level person again. And I think you hear that in the news. I've talked to other CEOs who have nothing to do with software development. They're in labor-based businesses like workforce development, autism supports, tutoring, things like this. And the story there is very different. I need to hire software engineers because we don't know how to do this. And I need my marketing department using AI. I need my operations team using AI. So I think we're going to just see a reshuffle of what jobs and how they get done. Longer term, what this leads to is new organizational models. And on the workforce side and the training side, what I'd like to see is a real revolution in how we do education, teaching, and learning. And much of our work, I give this talk to universities, and we really are pushing them to fundamentally rethink how do they add value in the modern age. And then the final step is potentially market transformation. Uber is a great example of this, where they're the largest taxi company in the world and they don't own a single taxi. So they have completely created a new organizational model, and it ultimately transformed the market. And it's transformed all kinds of markets, like even the hotel market with Airbnb and other groups like that. It is changing how people think about the service layers that make up an organization. So we've also done a lot of research around people's usage of AI. The things that we're finding is formal training is absent across pretty much all industries. We're hearing from executives two different stories. One is you can't use it, and the other is you got to use it all the time. The executive layer, executives are typically very far ahead of where the rest of an organization is, and they're not necessarily dealing with the day-to-day realities. So we see a big disconnect there. In those cases where executives are saying you can't use AI, we're a law firm, and you absolutely can't use AI, we see constant use of AI. People just pick up their phone, they use Claude on their phone, and they email themselves the results. So there has to be policies in place to deal with this. The other thing I think we found is that generic training is not very effectively. Actually, the best way to learn AI is just using AI and asking Claude or ChatGPT, and they have great trainings. But what we have found is people need to see it brought to life in their own circumstance for it to really be effective. So really understanding what use cases are out there and how to use it effectively, I think is an important part of the transformation process. Okay, so if we think about this from an education standpoint, and to me, when we think education, we're thinking broadly early childhood all the way to workforce development. And I think this is core to creating more equity in our society. So some of the principles that we have are, first off, we think LLMs, so AI, the fundamental thing that it is now doing is automating routine cognitive work at scale, at a just unbelievable scale. The things that you can do with it are staggering, although the real implementation is just going to take a lot of time, as we've talked about. If there is a misalignment between education organizations and the actual work that goes on, we think that is going to be increasingly problematic. And that much of the job for institutions focused on advantaging students, doing a better job, there needs to be a really tight connection between learning and work. And I am not suggesting education institutions need to entirely focus on serving corporations to help students get their entry-level job. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about giving students the skills so they can navigate a lifetime of work successfully. But the learning process has to take more of that work experience and work realities into consideration. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that shortly. I think we're seeing some widening of the wage gap between routine and non-routine work. That has been a consistent story for years. There's some countervailing pressures that I hope will change that. I think actually the skilled trades, as they get more and AI enabled, that I suspect that that's going to change for some of the skilled trades. Now, from an education standpoint, I think a very important thing to think about is content is really becoming commoditized. What would take us weeks to do to build robust content out, we can get a first draft done in minutes, basically. So as an example, in my work, when I teach at Johns Hopkins, my calculation is for every hour I teach, I probably do about 20 hours of development time. And that has completely been turned on its head. I did a little demonstration where I created a curriculum, a 6-month curriculum for individuals in the criminal justice system that was seminar-based, meeting 3 times a week with robust information and assessments in it. And it took me about 15 minutes. Now, we're not done. We wouldn't turn that over and implement it, but the speed to create content is just unbelievably dramatic. Okay. So all of these things we think are going to add up to dramatically changed institutions. So here's the crux of the argument that we're making about skills. So in a task-driven world, traditional learning is really well designed for that. With outcomes-driven work, this is fundamentally about the ability to achieve objectives. And so it calls for a different additional kind of learning, not moving away from traditional learning, but doing new things. It needs to be more experiential. We're seeing more coaching, more focus on things like oral defenses, live critiques, peer assessment, real world tests. The goal here is to really hone people's judgment, accountability, ownership, ability to communicate. And we've got some rules of the road here, but as an example, to really develop those skills, you just can't do it with a paper-based test. You need to put people in a real-world experience. Even if you're in a university, you can do this. If you're in a skilled trades organization, you can get them real-world experience in a low-stakes way, where you've got social pressure. And I think it's very clear to us as we look at the data, there's a role for online education, but in-person education really beats that. And I think we're seeing more and more of that going into the future. So I'll give you an example of this. So this is coming out of a university experience, but it applies to high school and even middle school as well. The way instructors typically give group work is they give the assignment, the students self-organize. You've got 4 students, they split it up 25% each. And then we hear the same story over and over again. Project went on for 6 weeks, came time to be done. 2 of the people didn't do the work, but my friend and I stayed up all night and we did the work and we got it done and we got an A. And we really resent those other people. That has nothing to do with group work in the real world. It's not role-based, like the idea that we would have a project and we just divide it up between the summer analyst and the CEO, and you'll take 45% and I'll take, that's not how work works. It's role-based. It requires discovery. How the students interact with each other should be part of the assessment process. I don't understand why more education institutions don't have rigorous peer assessment where they're teaching the students how to assess each other, how to give critical feedback. It's a huge lost opportunity. And one of the ways that we see professional and personal development really unfold is not in a one-time course, but over multiple experiences. So it's very important for individuals to learn how they're seen by other people, where their skill set lies, and to be self-critical. What we see a lot of times is the students who are shirking their work in the traditional group work aren't really even aware that they're letting their teammates down. And without being told, there's no way for them to change. So the fundamental argument that we're making is the move of what AI is going to be doing. It's partly about technical skills. Yes, that's important, but it's really about the ability of individuals to take accountability, to take ownership of complex problems and figure out how to solve them in a way that inspires confidence, alternatives are checked, and it results in a good outcome. And that is fundamentally what creates economic value. It's not actually the certificates and the degrees that you get going to a fancy school or a non-fancy school. It's the experiences you get doing that. And we think that there needs to be a quiet revolution in how these kinds of skills are taught. Further, they're also need to be taught differently in different parts of the country. So as an example, if you're teaching entrepreneurship, how you do that in Silicon Valley is very different from, say, doing that in the upper Midwest where you're surrounded by major manufacturing plants. Is different from a very hospitality-focused economy in Atlantic City, is different from doing this in Guangzhou, China. So there is a calibration process around skill development that we think needs to be regional and contextualized. So in the Baltimore area, we have a massive healthcare economy, medical devices, distribution, huge service industry. There is a tremendous amount going for the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Maryland region, but it is also different from the Florida economy. When we see this, we've done work at the associate's degree level, and we see very clearly the associate's degrees that create the biggest payoff are the ones that have really tightly tied to the regional economy, whether that's Allegheny County, which has a broad focus on medical systems, banking, and advanced manufacturing, or Whitfield County, which is the carpet capital of the world and really specializes in their students really moving into that area of workforce, or Jefferson County, which is really about oil extraction. So this tying of education into workforce is a very important thing. This is an example, a group called Accelerate U, which is based out of National Louis, that essentially is a workforce development program that is acting as a sourcing, an employee sourcing division, if you will, to private companies. And they have built this beautiful ecosystem where they are training individuals. They're giving them a 6-month certificate that articulates, if they want, at a future point, that all articulates perfectly into an associate's or 4-year degree at National Louis. The employers get exactly what they're looking for. It saves them time and money from a sourcing standpoint. And the participants have, this is in their first year, they've had a 74 to 80% completion rate. Nearly the same number are employed within 3 months, and they're getting a $12,000 to $13,000 average wage increase after completion. I think this speaks to the power of really tightening workforce development with the needs from an employer standpoint. Right. So my last point, and then let's open up for questions. These are what we think are the new rules for skill development. So first step is, a lot of people will talk about critical thinking and problem solving and communications as discrete skills, and they're not. Recognize that each one of those are clusters of dozens of sub-skills. Like critical thinking relies on the ability to ask good questions. That's one sub-skill of several dozen. So when we think about all the skills taxonomies that are out there, we actually think they're starting to do a disservice, and that there needs to be a new way of thinking about skill development, because it's just more complex than a lot of training companies want it to be. Number two, these non-routine skills are fundamentally social. This is also why AI cannot do them well, and they can't be mastered in isolation. You need to be doing this, at least in part, in a social environment. We've got to move assessment beyond procedural knowledge. One of the things that I like to see in education is not how did you score on the test, but like, did you get the job? Did you get a paper that you wrote submitted to a peer-reviewed journal? So not quite simulations, but creating in the educational environment stakes that look like the real world. Were you able to raise money as an entrepreneur, as an example? That's also much more engaging for students than how did you score? And it's the kind of thing that students will talk about and creates an emotional connection, reason to go to school, and a way to learn these kinds of skills that ultimately are going to be more important with the advent of AI. We talked about doing this over multiple rounds. Again, I think ownership is really the hardest thing to teach. And I wouldn't be surprised if you all would agree with the idea that if you have someone who can do the job pretty well and takes complete ownership versus someone who can do the job really well but does not take any ownership or accountability, for me, I'd rather have the person who takes ownership, because I know at the end of the day, they're going to end up doing a better job. Another point, I'm going to skip some of these. Teaching skills as skill chains is very important, not as isolated one-offs. We also think it's incredibly important to protect productive struggle. People struggling, even struggling socially, is a very important part of the learning process, because that's the kind of thing that actually leads to accountability and ownership. And the last one is, I think this is about teaching tacit skills and making the skills that would otherwise not be spoken, making them explicit. So like in our own work, we've been doing a lot of work trying to figure out what is it that the experts are doing that we need to change, we need to train the folks that are just coming out of college around. And it's very hard to identify these sort of sub skills. So as an example, we now talk about things like retraining, reframing, framing and reframing problems, and figuring out what the right language is very important. So let me stop there and let's move on to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, David. That was amazing. Great, great information. And there was a lot of engagement in the chat. So I do want to go right on over to a few of the questions
Right.
in the chat. The first one was from Colin. He said, David, would you be able to speak more on what hallucinations are?
Yeah. So um, there is a concept with AI which is known as temperature. And you can think of it as a setting from 0 to 1. And it is something that all of the models will set, and they don't really talk about how they're setting it. But if you set it at 0, you get as close to deterministic software as possible. 5 plus 5 equals 10, 5 times 5 equals 25. If you set it to 1, it's giving the AI much more leeway in its guessing process. So 5 times 5 might be 32. So the hallucinations are misguesses by the AI, and it has a self-correcting process. But particularly if you don't manage the context window very well, and if you don't test and verify, it can make all kinds of crazy stuff up. So as an example, we've seen cases where there are papers that were submitted to a peer-reviewed journal where the sourcing was accurate, it wasn't made up, but the secondary sourcing was made up. So fundamentally, it was based on papers, peer-reviewed papers that didn't exist, that were completely fabricated by AI. But there are ways to guard against that.
So, Dave, this Kyle, I appreciate your answer on that. So, I guess just some background. I became, part of BDEC, and my focus has always been on cybersecurity, as opposed to just, our original mission was basic connectivity. I was sort of the killjoy that raised my hand and said, "Hey, when we get all these new population connected to the internet for the first time in their lives, how do we protect them from becoming immediately victimized?" Same thing here. Can you speak a little bit more of the implications of generative AI for bad things that we have to remember? Bad actors, what do you do if someone uses AI to figure out how to more efficiently sell drugs in your neighborhood or something like that? How do we protect ourselves as a community? And I gotta drop something at my front door, but I'll be right back. I'd love you to hear your answer.
Yeah, let me see if I've got, no, I don't have it here. Yeah, one of the things that I like showing, by the way, we've put a survey on the screen. We'd love for you just, hold your camera up and take the survey. It will take about 3 to 5 minutes. There are lots of potentially bad things that AI is gonna create. We've seen everything from a friend of my wife's was out. They were out, basically, they were out dining, and they had a policy. The organization had a policy where you can't charge for liquor. And they took the receipt, took a picture, put it into AI, and changed this. They were showing AI, they were not actually doing this, and they did not submit this invoice. But they changed the invoice so that all the liquor was magically relabeled as food. So I think that's a small example where there's going to be tremendous opportunity for fraud that will become incredibly difficult to pick up on. Um, I think there's a lot of ethical considerations. We do a lot of work around mental health, and I think there's a real concern that people will form attachments to AI. Like Claude tells you that it's thinking, and if it's not clear from this, we think that's completely ridiculous. There's no thinking that is going on with these AI models, which doesn't take away anything from how powerful they are. But if people are buying into the idea that this is more than just pattern matching and it's really got sentience behind it, And I will go out on a limb and say this idea of artificial general intelligence, where it's conscious, it's never going to happen. It's just silly, and I can spend a lot of time talking about that. But I think when people think there's more going on than there really is, that can create, it can drive people to all kinds of negative behaviors that's problematic.
Thank you, David. I do want to move on to a few other questions,
Yep.
and thank you, Colin, for your questions and insights. From William, are governments and institutions investing in infrastructure and policies for communities, especially those traditionally left out of job growth, to prepare them for the changes that you articulate? How should policies be developed or shaped to address it?
Yeah, it's a great question and very interesting. I would say broadly the answer is no, but that there's certainly most governments, as we heard at the start of the conversation, have AI policies and are really grappling with this. I think last I looked, there's still something like 37% of schools ban AI and have a blanket, you cannot use it. That number is going down every year. What we have seen is that globally, there are governments and non-government organizations, nonprofits all over the world that are doing really interesting, completely innovative things. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is bringing to bear what are people very far, what are people in South Africa doing? What are people in Japan doing? What are people in Estonia doing for specific like solutions across the government and broad support organizations? But I do think we're at a point where AI is getting way ahead of where institutions are, and we need to figure out ways to catch up.
Thank you so much for that. From question from Nash, he said each of those tool substitutions created wider disparity divide in Baltimore and nationally. How to close the gap?
I think over time, I'm not sure I would agree that it's a blanket statement that the tool substitutions will create a broader gap, but they certainly create, it's certainly a danger, and there's certainly cases where that's definitely the case. I think to some extent, it's incumbent upon our public education system to figure out how to guard against that. There are parts of our society that are very important, like library systems, that I think in many ways have been undercut by the internet. I don't mean that in a bad way, but that sort of the reason for being before digitization was very different from what it is now. I think there's an opportunity for a real resurgence in organizations like libraries to bring citizens along in what they can do and how to create, how to not just broaden the gap, but to leapfrog things that might be very difficult for them. As an example, prepping for a job interview, AI can actually do a very, very good job helping you, if you're diligent about it, really helping to understand what questions are going to be asked, how do you present yourself, presenting the questions, using it as a back and forth. We do a lot of this work where you have set the AI up to challenge you and then answer verbally using dictation, and then get critique and then do it again and again. So I think it's a mixed bag, and there's a real opportunity for institutions to figure out how to bridge that divide. But it is, again, I think this is a generational process, and I think there will be a lot of people who are left behind in it.
Thank you, David. There's two more questions. I know we are at time. From Lynn Williams, how can faculty use AI to create objective-driven learning that aligns course activities, assessments, and student outcomes with clearly defined learning objectives?
That is a huge question and hard to answer quickly, but I'll give you one example. I took my syllabus, I teach entrepreneurship at Johns Hopkins. I took one case, a case study that I use that covers several days, and I put it into AI, and I gave a lot of prompting, and I developed a skills rubric based on what I am trying to teach. As an example, I realized part of what's really critical for me to teach in this case study is skepticism, to don't believe the narrative that the case study has. And so it's articulated that. I then had it turn this into a peer team rubric. Again, this is it, the first pass is minutes, and then I really worked with it to refine it. And then I've set this up where I can have the individual teams do assessment of themselves and each other, and then using AI, do the calibration. And so what I'm really interested in is then going in and looking at how well is it doing the calibration. And this feedback becomes something that's critical for the student to hear that otherwise I don't have the capability to do that. So that's a small example.
Thank you. And the last question is from Dante. Should there be an AI go-to person in anyone's workplace to help navigate comfortability with objective-driven learning?
Yes, yes. I think that makes a lot of sense. And ideally more than one person. And if it's a large organization, one person per department at least. Ideally, and what we see is in most organizations, there's, I don't know, a third of people are adopting it and a third of people are saying, I'm never going to adopt it. And that's a real problem, both for the organization and just across the board that it needs to be addressed. So yes, I think Dante, you've really nailed it. That would be ideal.
Awesome. And David and Reese, I do want to thank you. I know you had a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so I appreciate you staying beyond a few minutes. If you have any contact information you can drop in the chat, please do, because I know that some folks do have some follow-up questions. I know Nash put some follow-up questions in the chat that we don't have time to address, unfortunately. But if there is a contact you can put in the chat, that would be awesome. I do want to thank you before I welcome Whitney from Baltimore City's Office of Broadband and Digital Equity back to make an important announcement around Baltimore's AI framework. I do want to thank you, David, Tuscany Strategies, for really presenting this vital information. It's a lot to process. It is a lot to process. So if questions come up, please feel free to reach out to David. He put his email in the chat, or you can reach out to us at the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition, of course, at any time, and we're happy to make that connection as well. So thank you, David. Thank you, Reese, for joining us, and we look forward to this not being the last conversation with you all.
Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Whitney, I'll welcome you back to make your announcement for those who missed it at the start of our meeting.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Hey, everyone. I'm Whitney Moret from the Office of Broadband and Digital Equity with the Baltimore City's IT agency. We've got some upcoming activities around AI equity that I wanted to make everyone aware of. We are in the process of finishing up our current ARPA-funded grant and looking to the future of what digital equity means in the era of AI. So we are inviting your participation to help us create a framework for AI equity for Baltimore City. We're doing a lot of input sessions with residents and with ecosystem partners like BDEC. And we're going to start with an input session online, August 11th. BDEC has generously offered to host an additional meeting to focus on this topic. So it'll be really interactive. We're looking forward to seeing you there. We're also going to be holding an input session with community members. And then 2 big events for your calendars. Please save the date. August 26th, we're putting our heads together and actually creating this framework. And then we're unveiling and validating it at BDE's final event for our ARPA-funded grant period, which is during Digital Inclusion Week, October 6th. We're calling it an AI Equity Action Summit. So I really hope you'll all be there. If you have any questions, you can contact me. Easiest to remember, email address is bde@baltimorecity.gov. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Whitney. I appreciate all of you for your time and just sticking with us throughout these years. So we look forward to seeing you all on August 11th, where my co-chair, Chris Rizzo, will be hosting both the BDE, Whitney and her team. So please, please, please keep an eye out for that on the email. If you're not on the email listserv for BDEC, please drop your confirmation or information in the chat, and we'll be sure to add you. Awesome. So thank you all. Appreciate you. And we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day and be safe out there.